This is the No Stroke Podcast with your co-hosts David Dancero and Michael Garrow, helping you to support and thrive in life after stroke. Their podcast is designed for educational and community support purposes only and should not replace medical treatment and guidance of your own health professional team.
Welcome to episode 34 of the No Stroke Podcast. I'm Dave Dancero. I'm here with my co-host Michael Garrow.
David, you're a little under the weather this evening, so thanks for coming in and doing this intro. I don't want to put your voice out and have you get even raspier here. So we'll make it a short intro this week. I think we're really excited. We're going to be covering quite an interesting company that's been doing some cool stuff in the Afib space. And we'd like to get this episode and hope listeners are able to tune in when we release, because it's September is Afib Awareness Month, right? And Afib's something that a lot of us know about, but there's a lot that we uncovered in this episode. But before we get started, I know you wanted to highlight, we have two pieces for in the news that are themed to Afib. So why don't you kick off and then I'll go and we'll get right into the discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And I just wanted we should acknowledge, while we're, doing this session and getting it out for Afib, to push the end of the month here, but we're going to get this out in time. We should acknowledge in the news certainly what's happening in Florida right now as we speak with, Hurricane Ian, and looks like there are going to be some lives lost there, and we don't know. It seems like it crossed right through the state and is picking up steam on now the Atlantic coast coming up. So I wish everyone, it hopefully out of harm's way if you're not already, but certainly there's going to be a lot of a lot of cleanup and a lot of heartache after that. So we wish everyone the best there. And we've been busy this month, and this was a really good one to get recorded earlier today. We had a great guest, and I want to touch on and doing a little research for this show. AFib is something, certainly one of the top risk factors for stroke, and there's a great website that I want to call out on this called it's called stopafib.org. And I've never understood a lot of times how causes get recognized at the national or the federal or the state level, and this particular organization, again, it's stopafib.org, for patients, by patients, but really is well done. And I'm going to put it in the show notes because it talks about how their mission to actually raise awareness for AFib, and it gets into the different types of AFib, which I wasn't completely aware of. So in the sake of time and my voice, I'm just going to leave that as a great resource to refer to, and acknowledge the founder there, Melanie True Hills, who writes a really good blog about how AFib and her site was founded and how it became to be an awareness, part of an awareness month here. So as we close it out, I wanted to recognize that.
Cool. And yeah, super important work, and obviously, it's getting a lot of the attention this month. One other thing that, was just released, I believe it was earlier this month, is a research study that is in partnership with Northwestern University, Johns Hopkins University, and Apple. So what they're trying to do is, the Apple Watch has gotten a lot of attention over, the last few iterations of the watch, that now it's able to detect AFib. And as we will learn with our interview today with James, a lot of these detection results are often false positive. It's very hard to get these accurate readings unless it's continuous monitor. But obviously, we're in the early days. Hopefully innovation will get there. What this research study is trying to do, though, is cut down on the usage of blood thinners that are often used to prevent strokes from those who have AFib or at a higher risk. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting approach that they're taking. I know my mother, I'm sure possibly you, many other stroke survivors that are out there, are on blood thinners for life, and that causes a lot of other health issues, right? So yeah, it'll be interesting kind of see what comes of that. I believe it's I was looking at, it's a few year long research study that's going to be going on, but yeah, we'll keep an eye on it, see if we could either maybe bring in one of the researchers who are on the team, kind of get some insight there, which would be pretty cool. But today's guest is James Amihood, and he's from a company called Cardiokol. Cardiokol are, a nice tagline that was behind. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, you'll see the tagline for the company: saving lives using voice. And they're using the power of voice technology to ultimately detect atrial fibrillation and irregular heartbeats. So fascinating, approach that they're taking. James himself just joined the company about a year and a half ago, but has an extensive career within healthcare, leading organizations, heading business development, and has a background in chemistry. So he brings a lot to the table. They're based out of Israel, doing a lot of work in the EU, and just planning to kind of launch their initial phase of trials and get regulatory approval here in the US. So a company that we'll definitely keep our eye on, and once clinical trials do become available, we'll let the audience know. If you guys have any interest to reach out and learn more, we'll be sure to get you in touch. So with that,
Mike, I just like to add, I know we want to get into just pay attention to we think of AFib with stroke risk, increased stroke risk. Often unrecognized is the higher risk that we do touch on in this interview of leading to possible early dementia and kidney kidney disease, kidney failure. So this is a great interview, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to add that because that
was really a good point.
Yeah,
something that I wasn't really, and I don't think that's commonly shared, right? Like
absolutely,
everybody thinks AFib, everybody thinks a stroke, but yeah, a lot of other conditions result from this. So yeah, again, trying to do our part here. We're happy to bring you this episode. If you do enjoy it, please share, like, subscribe wherever you're getting your podcast. You might not think it helps, but it certainly does. And with that, here is the interview with James Amihood. Hi, James. Welcome to the No Stroke Podcast. Really nice to have you here today.
Great being here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So I think we have to thank podcast friend Jess DeMassa. That's how I ended up coming across your work and what you're doing. Timely as we're sitting at the last few days here of Afib Awareness Month in the US. So, it's a topic that is top of mind for a lot of folks, who are stroke survivors, but also one of the top risk factors, which we'll love to dive into and understand more. But you're taking a really interesting approach to treat AFib and detect it. So I'm excited to dive into that. But before we do that, let's cover, what got you to Cardiokol, some of your professional background. I believe you spent time at Schering Plough, which again, a good friend of the podcast, Jim Joyce, you guys might have crossed paths with in your day there. But yeah, please bring us up to speed kind of in your background, where you are today.
Yeah, so my background is physical chemistry, industrial engineering, and an MBA. And I spent most of my professional life in the field of healthcare. I started out with the big companies like Teva, Schering Plough, Perrigo, and in different positions and senior roles. And then I moved on to startup companies in the field of healthcare, raising a lot of money, managing the companies, doing deals with Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. And then I was approached basically by the seed investors in Cardiokol, together with the founders that were looking for someone to take the company to the next stage from a commercial perspective. And I joined the company a year and a half ago, and I joined it for two reasons. First of all, I thought the field of voice and the ability to both detect and to monitor different illnesses, starting out with atrial fibrillation, was amazing, like mind-blowing, and the potential is enormous. That's where the world is going. And the second, I really had a good connection to the people and the founders in the company.
That's interesting background, James, and thanks for joining the show today. I'm, as a stroke survivor, I'm definitely in tune to the term AFib. For our audience, can you tell us what makes it so hard to detect AFib, and what makes it such a risk factor for stroke and other conditions?
So the main problem with AFib is that a lot of the so-called devices out there, and the gold standard today is an ECG, are very short in duration of monitoring for the detection of AFib on the one hand, and they on the other hand are very costly, so they don't reach a lot of the populations that are hard to reach or hard to reach. And for those reasons mainly, the actual detection yield is very low. Meaning at the end of the day, it's not like there aren't good solutions out there, but they're costly and they don't actually monitor those patients on an ongoing basis for long periods of time, maybe besides the implantable loop recorders, ICMs, things like that.
That's really interesting. And I'd listened to a recent podcast or show you were on at WTF Health. And is that where the 5%, you mentioned there was a reference that around 5%, only 5% are detected. Is that, did I interpret that right?
Yeah, there's an article by Friedman that was published in one of the leading clinical papers that states the percentage of, I'm not again talking about the implantables, for example, of less than 5%. That's a clinical paper. But remember, the problem with AFib is that because AFib, especially in the paroxysmal stages, is so intermittent, and up to 90% of the episodes are actually asymptomatic, it's very hard. I look at it as like looking for a needle in a haystack. If you have 5 seconds now, in a month's time, you can have 5 minutes, and in half a year, you can have 2 hours. How are you going to pick it up if you aren't constantly monitoring those patients? Now, when you look at the studies that have come out, the Stop Stroke and the Loop study, you'll see that what they advise, especially those that are what's so-called the ticking bombs, those that actually got a high burden of the disease, are those that we should be looking out for, those that have got the high risk factors, and those at the end of the day that don't have an occasional episode of atrial fibrillation.
And another thing that, really caught me off, and obviously I've really thought of AFib and stroke risk, but can you talk to some of the other diseases we covered? I know you mentioned, early stage kidney disease, and there's a list of other conditions that result from AFib, correct?
Yeah, there are a list of different risk factors on the one hand, and on the other hand, it also talks about, what can actually happen to you. So, of course, stroke is the most common, but there's an increase in myocardial infarction, in heart failure, in kidney failure, in dementia, and those are all PA in the literature. Of course, those are additional complications, and the percentage of the patients that have got atrial fibrillation are much higher than the normal population.
So you're really, and again, you mentioned earlier, the ability for voice, right, to start to detect this. So, this is an approach, that really we haven't seen before. So I'd love for, spend some time, like what's this roadmap look like? I know you've been, with the company for a year and a half, but I'm sure you've kind of gone back, understand, what's gotten you to this point. So whose crazy idea was this? And like, how'd you get to where you are today with it?
So the crazy idea was actually one of the founders who's got a very, I would say, rich background in healthcare and as well as in medical device and in startups in this field. And like a lot of these things, that his mother had a stroke, and he couldn't imagine why in today's day and age there's nothing that's very cost effective that can actually monitor patients over long periods of time in a cost effective way. And that's what actually brought in, looking at literature, his background, together with 3 other founders. So there's a combination of telecommunications, telehealth, in the experience of the founders that have started multiple startups over the period of their lives that successfully, when they're sold, merged them, taken them public. And that's how he started the company. It was his brainchild.
Yeah, I love the more we interview experts and innovators in this area, it's always resonates with me, and I know Mike as well, with the mission driven. What was that purpose, and it was filling a need, an unmet need. And I went down the path, and I've shared with our audience, I'm a stroke survivor. Unfortunately learned about AFib when I was trying to rule out trying to find the cause of my stroke. So today, some 15, 16 years removed, and still living with life after stroke and helping other survivors. Like, I'm very I'm one that spent the extra money on the Apple Watch that had the detection. I've got my little, cardio mobile device that I check, and I do it because now, living in life after, I was one that had to wear that Holter monitor when they were trying to figure out. So I had, I know the heavy burden and accessing is so. Like, can you talk about what makes voice technology and Cardiokol, like, how is it different from these other solutions? Can you talk a little bit more about how it operates in the background, the way I understand it?
Yeah, so one thing I want to point out, the gold standard according to the guidelines is an ECG. We don't replace an ECG. What we do is we funnel the patients, especially the high-risk patients, and we raise a flag. So we're adjunctive, and we actually notify the physician or the patient, depending on the so-called medical legal background, depending on the country, if there could be a risk here. And then the physician will actually then decide if to give the patient an ECG or what to do. So we funnel those patients because of the low detection yield. On the one hand, as I mentioned, the high-risk patients. But actually, David, in your case, we also follow patients that are post-cardiac version or post-ablation. So if you think about those enormous percentage of patients that are post-cardiac version, post-ablation, that actually the return of AFib, as they've got a high chance of the return of AFib, what do you do with those patients over long periods of time again? And I'm not talking about the enormous percentage. I don't know, there's no real literature, but what I've heard is numbers of 50, 60% of the people either stop or don't start their NOACs, their novel anticoagulants, their blood thinners within a 2-year period. What do you do with all those patients over time to monitor them? If it was me, I think it would be very important for me to make sure I'm doing the most in order to avoid having, the return of atrial fibrillation.
Definitely, and I think we talked originally. You mentioned there's kind of 2 different approaches that you're taking here, right? One, I believe, a spot check, and then another more of a continuous check. So, do you want to kind of dive into both of those product lines?
Yeah. So just to clarify, we don't do continuous. What we do is we've got 2 different products. The first product is you do a voice test, or you give a voice sample twice a day for 5 seconds. That's like a spot check, but you do it on a regular basis. And it doesn't have to do if you feel palpitations or you don't feel palpitations, for the simple reason that, as I mentioned, up to 90% of the episodes are asymptomatic. So you've got an ongoing, you remember the past. You can actually we've got a few patents. One of them is adaptive testing. So we can schedule different tests depending on the outcome, if we spot AFib or not. That's the first product. And the second product we've already completed the proof of concept on is what you call natural speech or free speech. And that will basically be run in the background. Again, we've got ISO as a data privacy, and we've gone through different regulations on that as well. We're not listening to the voice, but we take vocal biomarkers from the voice whenever the person will be talking in the second product. And then we'll be able to check if the person's got atrial fibrillation, and that will happen at a much higher frequency because that the person talks much more than taking 2 samples a day. Although getting back to the loop and the stop stroke studies, you can see that there's a lot of value in doing 2 samples a day, but on an ongoing basis.
Quick follow-up question there. So the 2 samples of tests is a user calling that up through what platform is that on? Is it an app that, like, I'm thinking in terms of with the emergence of these voice assistants in the home, and is that something that they can activate that baseline or those samples that's needed?
Yeah, so in clinical trials, David, what we did is both in the hospital and the community setting, we've tested it out in over 700 patients to date. What we used was the person's own mobile phone in the community trial we did, and we did a landline. So we told the patient to go home and to give the voice samples twice a day. In this case, it was actually 3 times a day in the community setting in the clinical trial, and with their own phone in their natural surroundings. So we didn't give them any special tablet or anything special. That was the first product that we actually. That was the trial that we did in the community, and we haven't tested it yet on the smart speakers, but we assume that it can work on any voice user interface. But as I mentioned, the most common are the mobile phones or landline, because a lot of people, they haven't got smartphones. They've got phones or mobile phones, but not smartphones. And it's actually used as an application. So the application can sit like you download an application from the App Store. But what we've done is we've launched the product already locally here in Israel, and we give it to patients on the back of a telemonitoring company's application. So we don't adding additional applications or apps to the person's phone, and that's the way it can be used. So the preferred way is to use it, of course, with a third party that's already either a HMO or a provider or a payer or whatever the other people's apps, and fits on it exactly. And it reminds the patient in the first sample, in the first instance, when I said 2 voice samples a day, it reminds the patient with an SMS, for example, good morning, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith. Don't forget to please take your medication, and please give us a voice sample for 5 seconds.
Fascinating. So I think as a vetted healthcare man, you understand that, to bring these technologies into the patient's home, right? It's that regulatory pathway that's often, the largest hurdle. But it sounds like, you've been making progress both in Israel as well as some steps in Europe. And I believe, the US is a whole new beast for you, as you'll soon find out. But can you talk us to talk about that regulatory pathway? What approach are you guys taking for those different markets?
Yeah, so we're first and foremost, we're a medical company. We don't deal. Our focus in the first product at present is not wellness, but medical. That means we're getting and seeking, as you mentioned, the right regulatory approvals. For the US specifically, we've already done a regulatory assessment, a market assessment. We've already working with a company now that we plan to submit a pre-sub for the FDA. That means at the end of the day, we're going to seek FDA approval for our app.
That's super exciting, because, this is certainly, a technology and a solution that should be available to many patients. And, congratulations on the steps, you guys have made for this. And I think it's timely, that we're having this discussion. One, because of obviously Afib Awareness Month. It's something that, a lot of our listeners are quite attuned to, but also, and I don't know if it's come out recently enough, but, David mentioned the Apple Watch, right? And its ability to track AFib, although, there are a lot of false positives, of course, but, technology is improving and, we're going to have different solutions there. But there was an interesting study that was announced. I think it's like, however many millions of dollars were funded towards it with, I believe, John Hopkins and another hospital system, but really with the approach of, instead of a patient with AFib constantly needing to take a blood thinner, right, and be on this medication long term, which causes other health issues being on the medication, they're trying to take more of a targeted approach, right? And I'm sure you're aware of this study and some of the work that's happening here, to really be prescriptive. When that AFib, instance might be happening, then you're taking the medication, right? So it's quite interesting, but I just love to kind of get your perspective on that study and kind of the approach that they're thinking to take, and maybe how your technology could benefit.
So our focus is, first of all, to flag the potential of AFib when it happens, or to state alternatively that there's a certain burden of disease. At the end of the day, it's the physician's decision how he wants to treat the patient, when he wants to give the medication, when he wants to time the ECG, and all the rest of things. But I think the main, getting back to what you mentioned, wearables out there, AFib predominantly is something for the population of the 65 plus. The European Society of Cardiology calls for mass screening of everybody over the age of 65. Yes, it doesn't appear in the HA guidelines, but I think there's a strong awareness of risk factors and when a patient can actually get atrial fibrillation. And we also know from the literature and from talking to a lot of tier 1 key opinion leaders in the US that had, by the way, also invested personally, some of them, into the company. That the elderly don't like, or the people over the age of 65 don't like wearing wearables, and it hasn't caught on dramatically. And therefore, the voice is the most natural thing to do. That's first of all. And second of all, I think it's very important, of course, that you want something that's cost effective, and you want to also reach the populations, as I mentioned previously, hard to reach and hardly reach. So I think there's an enormous population out there at the end of the day that can greatly benefit from our solution.
Yeah, I like the way you described, that you would be prompted to do your testing, the ease of use. You would then say, reminder about medication. Can you do this? And then, of course, maybe get your daily dose of the No Stroke podcast could be that third item that we could put into the workflow. No, just kidding there.
Great idea.
Maybe someday. So after we air some of these episodes, we always get folks that come back to us after and say, I never heard about this. How do I get more involved? Because maybe could you talk to, is there in the US or we have, a further reach, we like to say worldwide millions of users, but we're getting there. But is there any clinical trials or any, like if patients or caregivers want to, reach out for a loved one or someone directly affected, is there anything that we can share to maybe get them involved in future maybe trials too?
So I can't say anything or mention any names. I can tell you that we are gearing up and we've got the initial start of both discussions and the initial engagement with some of the tier 1 US hospitals to do clinical trials. But I would say still it's a bit early days, but of course the emphasis there is of course to get that know-how, that experience and that testing in the US.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to continue to follow your journey and, make sure we're staying in touch and flag when those trials become available. So as we wrap up here, we finish every show with our magic wand question. So we're going to hand you the magic wand here, James. And, as an expert within the healthcare field, you've seen the pain points for many stroke survivors, both on the detection and rehab side. How would you take that magic wand and redesign the stroke care pathway?
So as an adjunctive solution out there, what I would look predominantly in doing is having on everybody's mobile phone, smart speaker, or whatever voice user interface, an app that can actually, first and foremost, be able to monitor and also raise a flag for the possible detection of AFib. So I wanted to have everybody, no matter their means, again, the hard to reach, the hardly reached, and of course, increasing the detection yield dramatically compared to where it is today.
Great,
I love that answer. Right.
And that was our low budget magic wand. I was giving you the tap there.
Thanks, David.
Awesome. Well, yeah, James, thank you again for the time. Excited to see, what comes here over the next, months and years with the company. I think it obviously has a great leader at its hands. So continue all the good work. And if again, we could be of any assistance, with trials or anything, kind of getting, survivors, caregivers involved, please reach out, and, we'll continue to highlight some of your work as we see it come in. Yeah. So thank you.
And James,
Mike and David, thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I really enjoyed it. And I wish everybody out there that they'll have this option available for their choice as quickly as possible.
And I love that tagline on the wall behind you for our YouTube listeners, using voice to save lives. So I think that says it all. Thank you, James, today for your time and your sharing your expertise.
Thank you.